When we think about our newborns, one of the things we need to realize is that humans, as mammals, our infants are the least mature, least well-developed of any mammals when they're born, which means that there's a heck of a lot that's going to happen to our babies when they're outside. But that doesn't, just because they're immature does not mean that they can't do a whole lot. And so we need to be able to provide for them the care that's going to enhance the abilities that they already have. There's a few basic things that an infant needs out of the environment. They need to stay warm, they need to feel secure, and they need nutrition and nurturing, that secure, nurturing sort of thing. So we look at what we are currently doing, and it varies a bit from hospital to hospital, but this is what we're currently doing. And that is, we can kind of sum it up in these three statements. The newborn is helpless, the mother is clueless, and the father is useless. And therefore, the healthcare staff has to do everything for everyone. Yes, the newborn does have needs that need to be met. But for the most part, mothers are made wonderfully. They can meet all of those needs, and that's why they were developed the way they were. Now, with premature or preterm or small or whatever, those infants that are a little on the even less mature side or sick side, then perhaps many of the health services that are provided in our intensive care units are needed. But even there, mothers can provide a lot of the care and a lot of the nurturing. And so as we go through, you'll hopefully be able to see how that all goes together. One of the other things that happens very frequently in many hospitals, and again, I'm making a generalization, so you'll see variations on this, but that is that right after birth, the infants are separated from their parents, frequently put in a warmer, taken to the nursery, and stay there, come out. We're doing more with rooming in so that they do stay in the rooms much of the time, but there's much more of a sense of separation. They're fed, they tend to be ignored when they're cried, and they're fed more on the schedule about every 2 to 4 hours. But can we do something better for our infants? And I'm going to hope that by the end you'll say yes. A slight aside is to think about what it is that we can do better. And that is to provide a habitat, i.e. that place where our infants, or a habitat in general, is that place where a species can live and grow. It's generally a physical environment that surrounds the infant, but it has within it that which is needed or utilized by the organism that's there. And so we can think of that in relationship to our infants as well. Within a habitat, a species or organism actually is able to do behaviors that are appropriate for that if it's in the correct habitat. And therefore, what we need to do is to provide the habitat so that the infant, in this case, so that the infant can begin to do activities that they're innately able to do. They're kind of inborn. And so what is there in the habitat really affects what the infants do. So the better we can provide. So I like my giraffe here. Certainly a changing habitat that they're in. But there are certainly things that he can do here where he does have some of his grasses and things, but those tall buildings, which aren't quite the right habitat for him, will change the activities. And that is kind of how I liken some of our newborn care. And we can provide them a habitat where they'll do okay and survive and things, but it's not really the ideal habitat for them. As I said, when they're in the correct habitat, you will see that they are really very physically and neurobehaviorally, meaning their nervous system is set up so that they can do behaviors that are programmed or innate that will help them provide for their own needs. And this is where the infant really isn't as immature as one might initially think they are. So, in the right habitat, the newborns will respond with a specific set of behaviors. And those behaviors that the newborn does really initiates caretaking responses. Now, as you can see here, I've shown a number of different mammals, and part of that is because of my experience I've had in this past year with my cat. who had 2 litters of kittens. And the first litter of kittens who were born full term, Mama cleaned them off and brought them all together and laid on her side in the box and brought them in so where they'd stay warm and did wonderful things in making sure that they were breastfed and staying with them and nurturing them from the get-go. The second litter that she had were a bit premature. And Mama didn't do those same activities that I saw her. I mean, she got them born and kind of cleaned up, but she was not settling down in their box or their environment that she had put together for them at all. And she seemed really worried and kind of pacing, and she'd go over and kind of get in the box, then she'd get out. And then one of the kittens died, and she tried to remove that, but she still just wasn't going in the box. And so finally, the nurse and me took over and said, I think I need a little intensive care here. And I put a 40-watt lamp over them to warm up the infants. And as the 3 that were left got warmer, they got a little bit stronger. And 2 in particular were finally able to get over, and particularly if I put them close to Mom, they were able to latch onto her teats. And when they were trying, because they weren't very good at doing the climbing like the bigger kitties, she did everything in the world she possibly could to help these on. She'd lay on her back, she spread her feet apart, she made sure that those teats were right out there where they could get at them. And what I saw after the 3rd kitten died, but with the 2 that were strong, was that as they got stronger, she started being around more. And eventually she became that good mom that I had seen the first time. But she knew, first of all, that there was something wrong and that she couldn't quite do it. And she certainly was trying, but she couldn't. And I'm sure that's the way a lot of moms feel when their infants end up in the intensive care unit. You want to be there, but you're not quite sure what you do and how you get to it. And as they get stronger, then you can kind of go, I want it. But what I really want most moms to feel is what the first litter had. Mama's there and feeding them and protecting them and being with them. But it was such a wonderful example for me of how these vary and how that care is there. Now, when we talk about the innate behaviors, one of the ones that to me is the most fun to watch happens fairly soon after birth. And if the infants are put, and I haven't explained what kangaroo care is, but kangaroo care is basically putting a diaper-clad infant, just so you don't get too messy, a diaper-clad infant on mom's abdomen or chest. And leaving them there for as long as you like. And in a few minutes we'll talk about some of the benefits of that. But at birth, when we put them there, babies for about the first 10, 12, 15 minutes after birth will kind of just lay there and not do anything. It's a bit of a recovery period. And then what you'll see them do is to start making movements. And they'll actually bring their knees up and literally crawl and start reaching out. They'll take their hand and they'll smell it, and they'll kind of look around a little bit, and they'll crawl up. And eventually you'll find that they've made it to the breast area. And they'll take their hands and they'll start to knead their breasts a little bit, and then smell them, and then they may come over, and eventually their mouth gets there, and then they'll nuzzle it with their nose and lick it a little bit, and look at it, and lift up their head and try to open their mouth and put it back down. But it's a very coordinated pattern of these activities that they are doing, which ultimately gets them to latching onto the breast and suckling. Now, the other thing that is being done here is that it is also helping mom develop more oxytocin, which is the hormone that helps both with breastfeeding, and many call it the love hormone because it really facilitates attachment and bonding. And so all of this maneuvering that they're doing really is increasing oxytocin levels for mom and baby.
UNICEF, WHO, and WABA, along with the scientific community, strongly recommends initiating breastfeeding within half an hour of birth. Soon after delivery and after the baby has cried and started breathing well, baby is shown to the mother and kept close to her with a cheek-to-cheek contact. This helps the mother to kiss the baby and also facilitates the local custom of saying a holy message in baby's ear. Subsequently, baby is kept prone in between the breasts. All care should be taken to prevent the baby from falling. If the weather is cold, then baby should be covered with a warm cloth. Baby is very alert soon after delivery and hence is at its instinctive best. Baby is also kept warm, being in close contact with the mother. Baby is also prevented from future infections because she starts acquiring healthy germs which will colonize her skin and intestines. Thus, this position ensures early instinctive stimulation and gives warmth, love, security, and also food. It also initiates bonding process between the baby and the mother. Kicks will give tender, firm jerks to the womb, stimulating it to contract. This will help to expel placenta and reduce bleeding. Once baby realizes that food is in close proximity, it starts salivating. Smell is a strong stimulus which drives the baby towards the nipple. Baby's smell sensation is well developed. Smell of a chemical on nipples is similar to the smell of a chemical in amniotic fluid which surrounds the baby in the womb. Mouthing movements start. Her shoulder, hip and neck muscles are sufficiently developed to help her move. Baby with her limited vision can see the areola. If baby raises her head, it can also see mother's face. Baby has reached the nipple, has raised her head and has nicely lashed it with wide open mouth and mouthful of breast. What a beautiful moment of joy for the mother and the child. This baby has reached the destination in just over 10 minutes. Majority of babies will successfully complete breast crawl in about 30 to 60 minutes. Like all other gifts of nature, this comes free of cost. However, the health and nutrition benefits offered will save millions of lives and will save billions in terms of health cost. It will create a generation which will reach highest human potential of growth and development. We request you to carry this message to all future mothers and their families to prepare them to experience this miracle. Train every health worker in the maternity service to help every baby and mother to initiate breastfeeding by nature's way.
When babies are not in the correct environment, what we hear from them is what we call a protest despair response. And there's actually a couple parts. First of all is a cry. And one of the things that happened with these baby kittens when mama wasn't around was that they cried. And man, did they cry. It was a cry that you just didn't want to hear or be a part of. It was kind of like, shut up after a while. But it was really that, it really was a despair cry. It was really that sense of something's wrong and I'm not quite sure what goes on. And you didn't hear it. Once mama got actively involved, we didn't hear it at all. But you can also see that part of what happens is that the infants really start splaying out. Their arms and legs have very movements that aren't very well coordinated or anything of that nature. They're really kind of going, I don't like this. frequently, particularly right after birth, and you can see these two in particular, literally immediately after birth, they're still wet and cold, and though they get put in a warmer or a radiant heater, they still are cold and they're not where they want to be in a nice, comfortable habitat. So we need to then think about perhaps doing things differently and getting the infants into the right habitat, making sure that literally as soon as they are born, that they get put on mom's abdomen or chest. I was telling the nurses this morning that there's some new guidelines that will be coming out that really say to wait until 2 minutes after birth before the cord is clamped and cut, so that the infants actually get a little bit more of the blood that's in the cord. Well, as my colleague said, if you're going to wait, there's not a whole heck of a lot of space that this baby can go because the cord is only so long. But it is long enough for them to be able to put the infants on the abdomen, and then to begin to see what will happen there. So once that infant is put there, mom starts to warm the infants up. And there are numerous studies, and I do mean numerous, that have looked at thermal regulation in newborn infants when they are on top of moms. And basically what all of them show is that when you put an infant in kangaroo care compared to whether or not they're under the radiant warmer, whether they're wrapped in blankets, even warm blankets, and swaddled and put in a cot, whether they're wrapped in blankets and held, whether you do like they do in India and put a warm mustard seed oil and then wrap them in saran wrap, no matter what way you try to warm up the babies, the most efficient way of warming them is by putting them in kangaroo care and allowing mom's body to provide the heat to these infants. Couple of studies to me that really showed this and makes me think that, wow, what a miracle we have in this relationship between mom and baby. One of them was that they put the little temperature gauges on hands and feet and other parts of the baby's body, both wrapped and in the crib, or dressed and wrapped and in a crib, or dressed, wrapped, and held, or in kangaroo care. And what they found was that those infants who were in kangaroo care developed peripheral circulation, the circulation in their hands and feet, which is usually the last thing to happen, and the reason why babies have blue hands and feet when they're first born, within 90 minutes. They had pink hands and feet, and they were warm and they stayed warm. For those infants who were in the cot or who were swaddled, it took up to 3 days for that same level of warmth to develop and for the peripheral circulation. 90 minutes versus 3 days. I think I'd vote for my 90 minutes to have good circulation, particularly given how much the infant has to work to adjust to extrauterine life. The other study, and the reason for my elephant here, is that another group did thermograms of the infants. And they did 3 thermograms, one immediately after delivery, which found they were basically all pink or showed all warmth, even the hands and feet. They then took the infants away from mom and washed them, bathed them, dried them, did some of the other treatments that get done. And then they took a thermogram, and the trunk was still pink or warm, but the hands and feet and arms weren't. They put them back into kangaroo care, and within an hour, those infants were totally pink and warm again, warm throughout. So that whether we did it 20, 30 years ago, or we do it with our new technical techniques and technology, we know that moms warm up their babies. Now, what happens? Well, this is one of the other things that I think is just absolutely fabulous. Dr. Luddington, who was one of my colleagues at Case, had a mother with twins who had been in the NICU. And she asked this mother if she could put temperature gauges or temperature measures on her breasts and measured the temperature of the infants. And these the twins happened to be slightly different temperatures. One was colder than the other. So she took and put the 2 infants on and then watched what happened. Well, over the short amount of time, she discovered that one breast got warmer than the other one did, so that it warmed up that cold baby. And eventually, once the babies were warmed up, the breast cooled down a little bit, but it keeps them in that neutral thermal environment, so that mom's breasts really regulate their temperature based on what the needs of the baby are, to keep them in an appropriate temperature for them to be able to thrive, so that they aren't stressed. The other things that have been shown then by the research that's been done, and in healthcare we keep talking about evidence-based practice, and is that infants who are in kangaroo care cry a whole lot less. They cry a whole lot less, but they also, one of the things we want to see from them immediately after delivery is that their heart rate and their respiratory rates become stable, and that happens. The other thing is how they begin to move through wake and sleep cycles and crying cycles. And with that comes their general movement of body. And again, we see that those kids who have been in kangaroo care, even for an hour or so, but have had some kangaroo care, start to do that sort of movement between states much more smoothly earlier if they've had the kangaroo care. Because I talked about the peripheral circulation, but Dr. Kennel, of Kennel and Klaus, who have written a lot of books on bonding and what happens early on. Dr. Kennel, after looking at the study that was done in Russia, because that's where the peripheral circulation study was done, said, it appears that swaddling was more stressful and potentially harmful to the infant rather than allowing the infant to remain in kangaroo care. We've gotten away from many of those practices that for years and years, centuries, we have known helps the baby because we can. But that doesn't mean that those practices are necessarily healthy or efficient for the infant. I mentioned they cry less. Certainly the distress cry, which we saw pictures of, is better. And with that crying, you see many fewer grimaces of the face. These babies are satisfied. We had fun just a little bit ago because we had a mom who had had a C-section today, and we went in and actually gave her one of the wraps, as you'll see down there, but just had her go into kangaroo care. And her daughter, first of 4, had been fretting a little bit beforehand, and she just was readily to say, we put the infant there, my daughter, she quieted down. Well, when we put the wrap on her and kind of tied that baby in, the smile she gave was so satisfying. It was like, oh, this is where this baby goes. It feels so good. And her daughter continued to sleep and looked like they went to sleep in a much greater way. That enhances the attachment as well, that bond between mother and baby. Putting it all together, kangaroo care seems to result in better central nervous system development, which is part of what we want immediately after, because we have reduced the stresses that these infants are experiencing. Not only does the heart and the lungs and many other things have to change, but their whole neurological system has to adapt to being outside of the uterus. And somehow or other, kangaroo care helps facilitate that adaptation. It helps to facilitate the brain development and the neurosynapses, the neurons' growth within the brain, so that these infants do function much quicker. So it really for the most part, are very positive. Matter of fact, when we look at the literature on both preterm and full term, there is not a study that shows that there's anything detrimental in doing kangaroo care. It may not show improvements over what we call routine care at this point in time, but it's not detrimental. And for the most part, it shows significant improvements. A study that hasn't been published yet, but I have been privileged to know the person who did this, Dr. Ann Bigelow up in Nova Scotia, is a still face study. Still face studies were actually started in psychology to see how that interaction was between mothers and infants. And in the still face, infants are usually in kind of a car seat or seat, and mothers will interact with them, talking to them, cooing to them, smiling and making faces. And then they'll make their face go blank for about 30 seconds. And what you see in infants in the older still faced was that they'll try to begin to coo or grimace or make faces to try to get that attention back. And at about 7 months in the original still face, they would reach out and try to bring mom. They'll coo. They'll just kind of say, hey, where are you? Where are you? It's what we call social bidding. Well, Dr. Bigelow had moms do kangaroo care 6 hours a day for the first week of life. and 2 hours a day for the next 2 to 3 weeks. And what she found when she did the still face, even after the first week, was that grimacing and things were occurring between mom and baby with the still face after the first week. At 3 months, when she did it again, the social bidding that we had seen at 7 months was being seen at 3 months. It meant they were cooing and reaching out. It all begins to show how this kangaroo care, this interaction between moms and babes, really facilitates the development and adaptations that infants need to go through as they are growing much earlier. It also basically says, maybe these 7 months wasn't a typical, isn't really typical. Other effects for studies that have gone on for any place from a year to several years that come up is that infants who have had kangaroo care have fewer infections. And part of that is not only because many of these infants breastfeed and get the benefits of breast milk and the immunoglobulins that come with that, but that there is also an enteromammary pathway, a skin-to-skin pathway where infants will pass to mom the bacteria or viruses that they have. Moms will make antibodies and then actually pass them back to baby. So you have a dual way that infections can be prevented or decreased. We've mentioned, just because parents crying, less fussy, less crying, as much as 10 times less kids in kangaroo care, 10 times less crying. When they also looked at crying and kangaroo care for painful procedures like some of the shots or heel sticks that we give the infants, and found that there too, the infants who were in kangaroo care cried very little. They might cry for a second or grimace for a second or two, whereas in one study after 10 minutes they literally had to stop collecting data on the babies who had not been in kangaroo care because they continued to cry for so long and they needed to bring them out of the routine. Infants, because of the interaction that they have, due to the closeness, parents or moms tend to talk to them, smile earlier, and ultimately when you start doing our indices that we look at for growth and development, how they're maturing later, those are much greater. They are higher indices for social development, language, and fine and gross motor indices. So how they move their hands, how they talk. One study even followed the infants out for 3 years and found that the infants who had kangaroo care early on, potty trained earlier, at least for urine, or stubborn more earlier, which is what you'd anticipate if they're well developed. They actually have a better independence, and so they may show their stubbornness more. And when the mothers and infants played together, there was much greater interaction between them, and the mothers tended to be more encouraging as opposed to saying, no, don't do that. That was a more positive type of interaction. So benefits, even for the preterm infants, are similar to those for the full-term infants. Their temperatures become regulated faster if they're in kangaroo care. They have better cardio and respiratory stabilization if they're in kangaroo care. There's less crying. And one of the things about less crying is that with crying, we put a lot of pressure in the brain, and we are concerned about all babies, but particularly the preterm ones, about having what we call cranial bleeds. But by not having those pressures that come because they're not crying, they're not as likely to have the bleeds, at least from that. And sleep. One of the most marvelous things that Dr. Luddington, my colleague, has worked on is looking through the use of EEGs at how infants sleep and comparing it with infants who are in the incubators and how well they sleep. And infants who are in kangaroo care, preterm infants, literally go through sleep cycles. They go down into the deep sleep and back up again. They have the real periods of quiet sleep. Whereas if you do EEGs on the infants who are in the incubators, they do not go through the sleep cycles. And it is very vital that the infants get into the deep sleep, because that's when their energy renews, that's when their growth happens, that's when a lot of the healing occurs. And so if we're not allowing infants, or anyone else for that matter, not to sleep, then we aren't helping them to heal as rapidly. And because of that, what we see with infants who are in kangaroo care, because of the type of stimulation that they get, which is very appropriate for their central nervous system, infants who have had kangaroo care through EEGs, show that 3 hours of kangaroo care is basically equivalent to 2 weeks of growth in an isolate. That's how much the kangaroo care just helps them out. Infants who have had kangaroo care, even the preterms, are able to regulate themselves. Kangaroo care means you're holding that baby skin to skin.
Like that?
Kind of like that. You got it. You got it. And so that not only do you see better regulation and emotional cognitive regulation early, but also at 3 and 6 months post-birth, and more efficient arousal, so that when they wake up, when the preterm infants wake up at later dates, they wake up better and can interact with you more. Improved attachment. One of the things, particularly with your preterm moms, is that because they don't have that chance to be there, because they haven't had their infant to help stimulate those things in mom that make them attached, attachments can be very, very poor and sometimes actually lead to increased abusive sorts of situations. And those mothers and infants who have had breastfeeding, their attachment is better, and so you have less of the abusive situations. Breastfeeding is a big one for kangaroo care, and for full terms, that's probably how kangaroo care is most associated. Even for preterms, the preterm infants who have done kangaroo care breastfeed or at least get breast milk, and more breast milk than those infants who are only in the incubator. And finally, and the thing that all hospitals like is that, I think they like, is that infants who have had kangaroo care tend to have a decreased length of stay, and depending upon the length, it can be 1 or 2 weeks earlier that they would go home because of the maturation that occurs. You know, they're doing better earlier. Certainly those of us who are paying for a lot of it are pleased to know that our healthcare dollars will go further. For the mother, there are also many benefits of kangaroo care. Back to the attachment and bonding, that's a two-way street, so if it's better for baby, it's better for mom. Increased maternal self-confidence. You know, when you can do something for your baby, whether it's a full-term infant or a preterm infant, you just feel like you're a mom, and that helps to move things along. Affectionate behaviors. The first studies, the ones that Kennel and Klaus did, and many of the first studies, really looked at how moms and babies interacted. And what they found was that mothers who had done even 15 minutes of kangaroo care touched and patted their infants more, talked to them, looked at them in face, interacted just a whole lot more. Because the infant's presence on the mom, along with what has happened during labor, increases the level of oxytocin. Oxytocin actually causes within the body the opposite effect that we see in fight or flight, and that is calm and relaxation. So moms who have done kangaroo care tend to have less anxiety, are relaxed. When you sit down, you can just enjoy being there and almost, I mean, it happens to anyone who is holding a kid, but kind of feel more like butter. You know, just those things go off and you can enjoy the minute. And because of the increased level of oxytocin and the frequency with which infants who are in kangaroo care tend to breastfeed, there's less engorgement and much more rapid involution or shrinking of the uterus, and therefore less bleeding after delivery. I mentioned this one already, but the fact that kangaroo care leads to more kissing and holding, just that interaction is so much greater when the mothers have had that chance to be skin to skin. One of the things that has come out as we get to World Breastfeeding Week is breastfeeding the first hour. I've changed it slightly to kangaroo care the first 2 hours. But it's real vital in getting all of these going. The kangaroo care starts immediately after birth, or at least within the first 30 minutes, or if there's something wrong, as soon as possible, that kids get into it. I talked about those innate behaviors that happen with baby, the increased oxytocin, the relationship that gets built. Those times are vital. If we miss the first 2 hours when the infants are the most alert, when their sense of smell is the greatest, which is another thing that happens to help them breastfeed, we miss a very sensitive or critical period in their life. And you can get some of it back. But for many mothers, missing that time, even if they really wanted to breastfeed, means that they don't breastfeed because it's harder to get that infant to latch on. And when the infants crawl naturally, or innately, they somehow latch on and moms feel positive. When during the first postpartum day, it doesn't work, and it doesn't work, and it doesn't work, and I'm tired, and now it's evening, and baby hasn't really eaten, and I'm frustrated, and they kind of go, I can't do it. My body won't do it. It's not that it can't. And the women who become successful breastfeeders, to me, are really, really saying, come hell or high water sort of thing, I'm going to breastfeed. But those who tend to have not quite that great a commitment, many times they won't. Or if the experience in those first hours and days aren't real good, they may supplement earlier or stop breastfeeding, as opposed to breastfeeding for what is recommended, at least 6 months exclusive breastfeeding. So enjoy those 2 hours. And as I've seen with so many of my patients, if you don't enjoy the infant in the first 2 hours after birth, when their eyes are open and when they'll look at you and gaze into your eyes, you might not see their eyes for another 2 to 3 days because they sleep so much. Even when they're breastfeeding, they might look asleep. So who can do it? I've been talking mostly about moms doing kangaroo care, but it's not something that's exclusive to moms. They aren't necessarily the only ones who can do kangaroo care, but dads. And the fun about the patient that I saw upstairs today is Dad wanted to do this so badly. He'd been holding baby and we gave him back to Mom, and he was kind of like, wait a minute. So you knew he was ready just to slip that baby down a shirt front or whatever and hold him kangaroo care. And kangaroo care. Grandparents can do it. And in those places where infants need it because they're in the ICU and because mom can't go, it may be a grandparent that can spend some of that time or increase the length of time. Or even the grandmothers who just have a healthy newborn and want to have the fun of knowing what that one's like. And siblings can do it. The picture in the middle is actually of my 2 daughters, who are both adopted from China. And when we went to pick up the second one, my oldest one, who was 4 at the time, wouldn't let her sister go. And so we kind of put together the pouch. It's not skin to skin, but she was holding him. And she really enjoyed that. Everybody down the dining room kept, she's going to drop her. But it helps them build it too. Because oxytocin, again, that affiliative hormone, is something not only in moms, but it's in babies, it's in fathers, it's in siblings, it's in all of us in helping. How do we do it? Well, immediately after birth, or you're laying down, you can just put baby on you. But sometimes you want to be able to kangaroo care and get up and move around. And you can do wraps from very informal things like this woman has, which is really just a piece of material tucked under the infant's body and then tied in the back so that it holds the infant close. Or you can do something that's a little bit more elegant. And because my dear friend Sylvia Houston, who is here, really has gotten interested in breastfeeding and then in kangaroo care, she got to know it more and said, hey, we need to do something to make kangaroo care easy. You have more elegant tops that, again, tie around and hold the infant's head in, support their neck, but allow you to also have your hands free to care for other children, to cook a meal, maybe to vacuum, but whatever else needs to be done. Many different types of tops. But they hold those infants close. And that is the best place for the infants. Not only after birth, not only while you're in the hospital, but for as long as you care to do kangaroo care. It continues to help with their development.